It wasn't the wind. Thomas Hartwell knew the many voices of the prairie wind, its summer whisper through the tall grass, its winter howl across snow drifts that buried fences. This sound was different, a soft, rhythmic scraping, insistent, desperate. It came from behind the barn where the gnarled branches of his failed apple tree clawed at the sky. He set down his bucket of feed, the familiar weight leaving his hand. The prairie wind in the autumn of 1847 carried more than dust. It carried whispers of broken families of cholera on the trail of the gnawing beast called hunger. And Thomas, a man who lived intimately with ghosts, felt a cold premonition tighten in his chest. A memory surfaced unbidden, a small, feverish hand clutching his herb promise he couldn't keep. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that whatever he was about to find would unravel the lonely, quiet tapestry of his life. He rounded the corner of his weathered barn, and the scene struck him like a physical blow. A woman knelt in the dirt, her worn calico dress spread around her like wilted petals. Beside her, two little girls, one, maybe eight the other, no more than 5, sat with a solemnity far beyond their years. All three were scraping mold from rotten apples. The fruit casualties of an early frost lay scattered in the dirt. With painstaking slowness, they peeled away the brown, mushy parts, eating what little remained with a silent, methodical desperation that spoke of weeks, perhaps months, of gnawing emptiness. The sight of it, the small, determined hands of the children working to salvage a mouthful of spoiled fruit, ignited the old cold grief in Thomas's heart. It was the ghost of his sister Alara, dead from a fever years ago. A fever he had failed to outrun, a doctor he had failed to fetch in time. The woman looked up, her green eyes startlingly bright, in a face etched with hardship widened with fear and shame. She scrambled to her feet, pulling her daughters up as if by invisible strings. "Please, mister," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle. "We weren't stealing. They were on the ground." Thomas held up a hand, its skin as cracked and weathered as the land itself. "Easy there, ma'am. Ain't nobody said nothing about stealing." He studied them. The mother was younger than he'd first thought, barely 25, but the prairie had aged her with a cruel, unforgiving hand. The older girl, Emma, had her mother's stubborn jaw and watchful eyes that missed nothing. The younger Lucy had blue eyes that held a quiet, heartbreaking acceptance of a world that offered no comfort. "Where you folks headed?" Thomas asked, his voice softer than he intended. The woman's chin lifted a small bastion of pride in a sea of despair. "West, California," he nodded. Gold fever. A fool's dream that had planted more graves than fortunes. "Got family out there?" A shadow passed through her eyes. "My husband," she said, her hand unconsciously straying to a small worn leather pouch tied at her waist. "James. He went on ahead last spring, said he'd send for us." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. No word had come. The wind picked up a mournful sigh, and little Lucy shivered. The sight of it, that small, involuntary tremor, was the final push. Alara had shivered just like that. He couldn't save his sister. But God help him, he could do something now. He shrugged out of his heavy wool coat, his mother's last gift, a fortress against the cold that still smelled faintly of her wood smoke and lavender, and held it out. "Come on in," he said simply. "No sense standing in the cold when there's a warm house just yonder." She recoiled as if he'd offered a rattlesnake. "Oh, no, sir. We couldn't. We're a bother." "William Wasina, ma'am," Thomas said, his voice gentle but unyielding. "When's the last time these little ones had a proper hot meal, a real one that didn't come from the dirt?" The question shattered her composure. Her face crumpled for a brief second before she wrestled it back into a mask of stoicism. "We've been making do." "Making do ain't the same as livin'," he replied. "Name's Thomas Hartwell. This here is my place. I'm extending an invitation to supper. Just a meal and a warm place to sleep for the night. We'll talk about the rest tomorrow." She looked from his honest face to her daughter's hungry eyes. He saw the war inside her pride versus a mother's fierce, desperate love. "I'm Sarah McKinnon," she said finally, the words of surrender. "These are my daughters, Emma and Lucy." "Mama, I'm powerful hungry," Emma said, her small voice cutting through the tension with the simple truth of a child. Sarah's last wall of resistance crumbled. "We don't have money," she said in a rush. "But I can work. I can cook clean men. We can talk about all that over supper." Thomas repeated, holding out the coat again. This time she took it. The rough wool enveloped her, a tangible promise of warmth and safety. As they walked to the house, little Lucy, in a moment of pure childish trust, slipped her cold hand into Thomas's. "Mr. Thomas," she asked, "do you got any real apples?" A genuine smile touched Thomas's lips, the first in a long time. "I surely do, little miss. In the root cellar, sweet as honey and crisp as an autumn morning." The house was a fortress of his own, making sturdy logs a solid stone hearth. He built a fire that crackled to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was a lonely man's home, neat and functional, but as Sarah and the girls stepped inside, it felt different, warmer. As he sliced thick slabs of ham and bread he'd baked himself, he was acutely aware of the quiet sounds behind him. The soft scrape of chairs, Emma's whispered reminder to Lucy about manners, the sheer wonder in their eyes as they took in the well-stocked shelves. To them, this wasn't just a house, it was a miracle. Over a hearty stew of salt pork and potatoes, the story of their journey unfolded in fragments. A farm lost to the bank in Ohio. The long, agonizing wait for a letter that never came. A wagon wheel that shattered, forcing them to abandon their last symbol of a civilized life. "James, he was always a dreamer," Sarah said, staring into the depths of her bowl. "He believed in the stories, gold just lying on the ground." She fingered the leather pouch at her waist again. "He carved this for me before he left." She pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden bird. "Said it was a bluebird for happiness. Said he'd be sending for us by harvest time." Harvest time had come and gone. Thomas said nothing, but his heart ached for her. He knew the hollow ring of a broken promise. Later, after offering them the spare room, Sarah paused in the doorway, her eyes searching his. "Why?" she asked again, the question no longer laced with fear, but with a deep, weary confusion. Thomas looked out the window at the vast, empty darkness of the prairie. He thought of Ilara's grave on the small hill behind the house. "Years ago, I made a promise to my little sister," he said, his voice low and rough. "I broke it. Maybe I'm just trying to keep a different one." That night, sleep did not come easily. He lay awake listening to the alien sounds of life in his home. A soft cough, a whispered reassurance, the gentle rhythm of breathing from the next room. They weren't just guests. They were a living, breathing reminder of everything he had lost, and everything he was now terrifyingly responsible for. The next day, a fragile domesticity took root. Sarah, refusing to be idle, moved about the kitchen with a quiet efficiency that transformed the space. Emma, practical and serious, proved a surprisingly capable helper. Only Lucy seemed to remember how to be a child chasing butterflies in the tall grass. Thomas took them on a tour of the homestead, a quiet pride in his voice as he showed them the fruits of his 8 years of labor. The sturdy barn, the fields of wheat, the well he'd dug by hand. "A man likes to know what's coming his way," he said, shielding his eyes as he scanned the horizon. As if summoned by his words, a dust cloud appeared. A rider moving with urgency. It was Doc Morrison. His face, usually weathered and kind, was a mask of grim news. "Thomas, raiders. Kiowa, we think. They burned out the Hendersons. They're moving this way." The world seemed to shrink to the small patch of ground they stood on. Thomas felt Sarah stiffen beside him, her hand flying to Emma's shoulder. "Folks are fording up in town," Doc warned, his eyes lingering on Sarah and the girls. "Might be wise, Thomas. Especially now." "We will go," Sarah said at once, her voice tight. "We will not be the cause of more trouble for you." "No," Thomas said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The road to town is 20 miles of open country. It's a coffin. We're safer here." He looked at the house he had built. It was more than a home. It was a fortress. "We stay, and we prepare." The next 24 hours were a blur of tense activity. Thomas methodically checked his weapons, cleaning and loading each one. He walked Sarah through the operation of the heavy shotgun, his hands guiding hers, a strange and unsettling intimacy in the lesson of death. "Point it," he instructed, "and don't think. Just pull the trigger." They hauled buckets of water into the house, enough to fight a fire. They barred the shutters. The homestead transformed from a place of sanctuary to a defensive position. The air grew thick with unspoken fear. That evening, Jake Peterson, his closest neighbor, rode in. "Saw the Hendersons smoke," he said, his face grim. They lost everything. I'm staying put. My place is built for it. So's yours. He tipped his hat to Sarah. Ma'am, looks like you picked a hard time for a visit. We'll manage, Sarah replied, her voice steady, her chin high. After Jake left, a heavy silence fell with the dusk. Thomas found Sarah on the porch, staring out at the horizon, now a deep, bruised purple. I never asked you about your sister, she said softly. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Elara, she was 10, took a fever. The snow was too deep, the drifts too high. I tried to get to the doctor. I wasn't fast enough. He looked at his hands. These hands built this whole place, but they couldn't save her. That wasn't your fault, Thomas. Wasn't it? He asked the old Gilderoy wound. I was the man of the house. It was my job. In that shared moment of vulnerability, something shifted between them. They were no longer just a protector and his wards. They were two people bound by loss and the looming threat of more. The attack came in the gray liminal hour before dawn. A single, quickly muffled horse whinny was the only warning. Thomas was at the window in an instant, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. Shadows detached themselves from the darkness. 7 of them. Sarah, he hissed at the bedroom door. Get the girls to the cellar, now. He didn't wait for a reply. The first arrow thudded into the shutter beside his head, and the world exploded into chaos. His rifle cracked and a shadow fell. A voice, guttural and laced with menace, called out in broken English. Come out, white man, we know you have women. Then came the fire. A flaming arrow arced high, a terrible comet, and struck the roof. Thomas cursed, his blood running cold. He could fight men. Fire was a different beast. He rushed to a back window, spotted a warrior preparing another fire arrow, and fired. The warrior dropped, but the diversion cost him. The front door splintered under the heavy blow of a tomahawk. It held, but not for long. He could hear Sarah's frantic, whispered movements in the kitchen, getting the girls through the trap door. Good. Safe. The door burst inward. 2 warriors' faces painted for war stormed in. The roar of the shotgun was a deafening cataclysm in the small room. Both men went down in a spray of violence. But more were coming. Thomas dropped the shotgun, grabbing his rifle, working the lever action. He shot another in the doorway. A searing, white-hot pain tore across his shoulder. He staggered back, the room swimming. An arrow. He was bleeding, his strength failing. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw the flames beginning to lick down from the ceiling. It was over. The house was lost. Grabbing his rifle and ammunition bag, he stumbled toward the kitchen, toward the trap door, toward the one thing left to protect. He dropped into the cool, earthy darkness of the root cellar, just as the floor above him erupted in the sound of triumphant shouts and shattering wood. You're hurt, Sarah whispered, her face a pale oval in the gloom. It's nothing, he lied, leaning against the damp earth wall, the world tilting precariously. Above, the sounds of destruction were punctuated by the roar of the growing fire. The smoke began to seep through the floorboards. They're burning it to the ground, he rasped. We have to go. He led them to the hidden escape tunnel, a narrow, suffocating passage to the barn he dug during his first lonely winter. Every movement was agony for his shoulder. He could hear Sarah behind him, her voice a constant calming murmur to the terrified girls. They emerged into the hay-scented darkness of the barn. Peeking through a crack in the wall, Thomas watched his life's work burn. The house, the furniture his father had made his mother's quilts, all turning to ash. The raiders weren't leaving. They were gathered around the inferno, waiting silhouetted against the flames like demons. They know we're not in there, Thomas whispered grimly. They're waiting for us to run. They huddled in the darkest corner of the barn for what felt like an eternity. Hours passed. The sun rose high. Finally, the warriors, satisfied, rode away. When it was safe, they emerged into the daylight. All that remained of the house was a smoking, blackened skeleton. Sarah stared at it, her face stricken. This is our fault. No, Thomas said, his voice rough. He looked from the ashes of his past to the 3 living, breathing people beside him. This is just timber. It's not a home. Not anymore. Little Lucy, her face smudged with soot, tugged his sleeve. I'm sorry they burned your house, Mr. Thomas. He knelt, wincing, and looked into her eyes. It's all right, little miss. A house can be rebuilt. What matters is that we're all safe. And as he said it, he realized it was the truest thing he had ever said. The journey to the Petersons' homestead was a slow, painful trek through the night. Jake and his wife, Martha, took them in like family. Martha, a woman of immense warmth and practicality, took charge. She cleaned Thomas's wound, fed the girls, and sat with Sarah at the kitchen table long after the house was quiet. "A woman alone on the trail," Martha said, shaking her head as she poured Sarah a cup of coffee. "You're made of stronger stuff than I am." "I wasn't alone," Sarah said quietly. "I had my girls, and I had hope." She touched the leather pouch. A week later, Jake returned from town with the mail. There was one letter. For Sarah McKinnon. Thomas watched from a distance as she opened it. He saw the flicker of hope in her eyes quickly extinguished, replaced by a profound, soul-deep stillness. She sat on the porch for over an hour, just holding the letter and the small wooden bird in her hands. Finally, she came to Thomas. Her face was calm, free. It was from a priest. James died of a fever 6 months ago. He was broke. He never even made it to the goldfields. She opened her hand. The little carved bird lay in her palm. "He carved this the day he left. All this time I thought I was holding on to a promise. I was just holding on to a piece of wood." She let it fall to the ground. "I've been a widow for a long time. I just didn't let myself know it." That evening the sunset bled across the sky. Thomas found her on the porch. "I lost my sister Elara." He said the words coming easier now. "I thought if I built a strong enough house, a good enough farm, I could keep loss away. I was wrong. It's not the walls that keep you safe." He looked at her, at the strength in her tired eyes. "I don't have a house anymore, Sarah. I have nothing to offer but calloused hands and a willingness to start over from ash." He took a breath. "But a man shouldn't have to build a home alone. And a woman like you and 2 girls like yours, they shouldn't have to be alone either. Sarah, will you and the girls build a new home with me?" Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time they were tears of joy. She reached out and took his hand. "Thomas Hartwell," she whispered, "my home isn't a place. It's wherever you and my daughters are. Yes, yes, I will marry you." They were married in the Petersons' yard under the vast Kansas sky. Emma stood beside her mother, proud and solemn. Lucy scattered wildflower petals. And as Thomas slipped his mother's ring onto Sarah's finger, he knew he wasn't just gaining a wife and 2 daughters. He was finally truly coming home. The following spring, they pointed their wagon west toward the green promise of Oregon. The journey was hard, but they were not afraid. They had faced fire and death and had come out the other side stronger and whole. They found their land, built their house, and planted a garden. And one of the first things Sarah planted was an apple sapling carried all the way from Kansas. Years later, on quiet autumn evenings, Thomas and Sarah would sit on their porch, watching their grandchildren play under its fruit-laden branches. They would remember a day by a burned-down barn when a desperate family was eating rotten apples, and a lonely, grieving man chose kindness over fear, and in doing so, found his own unexpected bountiful harvest. 84s.